It's a sunny and breezy morning here in Pavilion Gardens Cafe in Brighton. My thoughts once again turn to Edinburgh Fringe, but I think what I'm about to talk about relates to any fringe, in fact any kind of fringe theatre making, but where it's particularly relevant to Edinburgh is to do with the scale of it and the noise of it and the short get-ins and the short get-outs. You can probably hear vehicles in the background, you might hear people shouting, and you might hear seagulls, which is the typical morning here in Brighton. And what I'm particularly focusing on, particularly with some feedback from our reviewers over the years, is to do with narrative in theatre. And what narrative is all about is essentially the meaningful flow of a particular story. And narratives can be simple, they can be a beginning, a middle and an end, and of course they can be complex and extremely original and creative. And this is not about having narratives that are just about beginning, middle and end, but they are about narratives being in a way accessible, relating to the way you'd like them to be accessible. And that doesn't mean that the audience have to get everything, and you might leave audiences pondering what something means, or you might deliberately choose to have the threads of a story not tied up at the end. But again, that needs to be intentional, and that needs to be, I would say, for audiences, if the narrative at the end is unsatisfying, but they know it's intentional, that's okay. You can leave things on a knife edge, you can leave things where the threads have just all unravelled, or you might just have a straightforward story where people get it and the thing does have a very, very clear ending. Essentially, there are all kinds of different ways of playing with narrative and all kinds of different ways in art. So this is not about that. I think it is partly about intention, an audience is not being bamboozled by narrative if that's not the intention. But I think it's also about whatever the narrative structure of your piece is, as you arrive at the Edinburgh Fringe, there are ways that narrative can be scuppered by the nature of a fringe festival being busy with short get-ins and short get-outs, but particularly where a slot that's offered to you can't come in over an hour. And in a lot of cases you're encouraged to do 50 minutes simply because you're going to go into another slot that you have to pay for in venues that literally have shows running on the hour. And that can put narrative pressure on you, or pressure on the narrative, because you may well have had a show that's 70 minutes long or an hour and a half, or even had an interval, and because of cost reasons you're coming into a venue and you've chosen it because it's a more prominent venue and is likely to get you bigger audiences and increase the chances of reviews, but it means you've had to make the compromise of cutting your show down. And I've certainly picked up advice of people that when they create new work and are considering coming to something like the Edinburgh Fringe, right from the very get-go they create two versions of their show. One, the longer version that may well tour around or may well play for a run in a venue where the length is not an issue, and then they create their Edinburgh kind of baked in time-wise version, which is right from the start, the second version that is at 50 minutes or an hour. So as I record this, that might be a bit late for this year's Fringe, but as you create work you might want to consider, if it's a high possibility you're going to play several weeks at something like the Edinburgh Fringe, that right from the start you take creative opportunity to have two versions of your show. I think the nightmare scenario is when you realise too late that the implications for your show that's at 90 minutes is you haven't thought through, or it's difficult because of the way you've created the narrative, you haven't thought through how that is going to be cut down significantly. And even the term cutting down, doing surgery on your script, is a kind of negative place, and for many people, I'd say for most people, that's not a good place to be, and it often does not do justice to your work if you're just taking scissors to the pages to cut stuff out. I'd say more positively, there is a creative opportunity, even probably in the late stages, to just look at your script with fresh eyes, bring in a dramaturg, somebody who can really play with structure and narrative in a very positive way, and rather than say how do we cut this down, say what does this need to be creatively to be 50 minutes long. And that can involve some really tough decisions, but they could also be quite passionate and creative ones too. It can involve going up with a cast of 3 instead of 5. It can involve taking characters out. It can involve creating very kind of technologically, I've seen shows play around with voiceover in certain ways. It can involve changing the story, changing the narrative direction, simplifying something that's complex, or if you keep something complex, just really working on the clarity. That can involve taking things that were in a certain order and delaying something to come later in your piece, or getting quite a lot of plot and character revelation out quite early, so that what was in narrative linear flow becomes foundational, and then the linear flow comes from that. So ultimately, narrative is key, because what you don't want is to get reviews, if you're after reviews, and what you don't want is audiences coming out confused or disappointed for the wrong reasons. One way, of course, is to really identify what is the absolute baseline essential element in the narrative that can't be cut, but where can certain characters that were foreground become backgrounded? Where might the script have somebody refer to a character rather than have them physically present on stage? It might well be that you take a scene out entirely, or that you have to combine scenes or recast them. Sometimes it really can be that a whole scene is just summarised literally in a reference to it in a sentence, as if it's already happened. There are lots and lots of ways to play, and I think it can be positive, but with the Edinburgh Fringe it can be difficult playing with narrative, simply because you've got this pressure that the main reason for cutting down at the Edinburgh Fringe is you simply don't have the time in your venue that you might ideally like. So to summarise that, try if you can to see this as a creative opportunity, and it can even be that you play during your rehearsals and quite late in the day you realise that you're having to make cuts. It can actually be that in a particular venue you're starting to feel you had cut things down or reshaped your script, but now here in Edinburgh it feels like things are hurried, and you're squeezing stuff in, and that wasn't the case in your rehearsals back home. And so you might need to look at this again, which is why I guess shows also play the week 0 at places like the Edinburgh Fringe. They have a preview night where they're not inviting reviewers in, and it can be good to do a couple of preview nights before you arrive in Edinburgh, and play maybe one night to an audience that's going to give you feedback, a bit like a scratch night that you might have done. But ideally you're not doing that, of course, at the last minute. In Edinburgh, where the stakes are high, some companies might play a smaller fringe festival. That's not to denigrate that fringe, but they might bring the work with the specific aim of previewing it to see where further cuts might be needed to get it down to 50 minutes. Of course, in the ideal world, from day 0, if you know you're going to play 50 minutes, you're going to do that right from the start. But overall, see it as a creative opportunity rather than a stressy problem.